Geopolitics and Empire is joined by ethicist Daniel Natal of the Daniel Natal Show, and he's also a top-tier analyst and brain. Welcome to the podcast, Daniel.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I am not a top tier brain. That would be you, I think. Big fan of yours, always have been, and follow your work very closely so that I can plagiarize it.
No, I mean your stuff is fantastic. We chatted on my TNT program last year, and it's time to have you on. And I think one of the topics we're going to broach that everyone is broaching now is who rules the world. I was on Jeremy Ryan Slate's program. He was asking that question. I was on Sean Atwood's program. He was asking that question. Everyone wants to know now who rules the world. So let's get into that.
Well, I've got an interesting theory, and my interesting theory, and this is going to go way down the rabbit hole, and hopefully it doesn't bore anybody, but it starts with my son. My son asked about the Middle Ages. He suddenly got into, kind of the feudal age for whatever reason. And so we studied it. We read a couple books on it, saw videos on it. And there's three basic powers in the Middle Ages. One was, of course, the kings. One was, of course, the church. And the third that nobody talks about are the guilds. Right. And so there were the mercantile guilds and the trade guilds were the two basic. But for our purposes, it's the mercantile guilds. Basically were extremely powerful. They ruled the Middle Ages. Most of the domestic policy was done by these guilds. The king was, dealing with international stuff. The church was dealing with international stuff. But for domestic affairs, the guilds, basically, as I said, very socialistic. They would set the prices. So if you were a cobbler, you couldn't set the prices for your shoes. They also didn't allow innovation. If you came up with a new way to do something, they said, no, you're going to do it like your father and grandfather did it. So basically, Europe goes into stagnation. There's much social stability, but a lot of stagnation for 1,000 years. And so the guilds eventually come into conflict with the kings and the church, and everybody's going through this power dynamic. And if you read Dante, which me and my son did, just to mention him again, he talks in there all throughout the Divine Comedy about the popes fighting with the German emperor, and you have all these battles. And so there was this battle for supremacy, and we always concentrate on that, the pope versus the emperor. We never pay attention to this third group, and that's where the story gets really interesting, because I saw, and I went down the rabbit hole. Starting with this, somebody posted the flag of the British East India Company, and it looked surprisingly like what we think of as the American flag. It had 13 red and white stripes, and it had a field of blue in the upper left-hand corner. And I was like, that's odd. It had a Union Jack originally. And so that got my curiosity, and I was like, okay, so what does the British East India Company have to do with this? And one of the things is the mercantile guilds, right? So the mercantile guilds essentially gain power and money through mercantile activities, right? The Industrial Revolution happens. They get textiles for very cheap. They sail to Asia, trade the textiles for spices and stuff, coffee and gold and everything else. They come back, through this arbitrage, and they get vastly wealthy. And one of the things that happens is the Protestant Reformation. When the Protestant Reformation happens, the church basically stops being able to tithe people in Northern Europe. And so if you don't have to give up 10% of your money to the church, that 10%, well, why don't you invest it with the guilds, with the mercantile guilds? They suddenly get extremely wealthy. And all of a sudden, the power dynamic shifts away from the traditional aristocracy and the church as they're being kind of weakened by this third group, and the money flows are going. And all of a sudden, the growth of corporations happens. But I'll shut up there because I've been talking for way too long. So jump in.
No, I think you're really on to something, and I think this is why we have to have a deep understanding of history, and then that's why I like guests like yourself, because all this, everything that everyone's talking about today, World Economic Forum, that didn't just start in 72 when Cobra Commander Klaus ostensibly founded it with Henry Kissinger's blessing and CIA backing. I read a story just last week from Bloomberg, right? Bloomberg Media, and they mentioned the Prince of Liechtenstein, I believe, and it was just fascinating, this piece where they mention how he's now managing 300 billion for the wealthy elites, this huge portfolio, but they mention how the wealth of these elites in Liechtenstein goes back to the year 1200, right, to the 13th century, where they owned vast swaths of land throughout Europe, Germany and beyond. And I think this goes back exactly to what you're talking about now. And then my best answer to the people who've asked me who runs the world, and I think a lot of it goes to these nameless, European dynasties. They go back 1,000 whatever years, and so please continue.
Yeah, some people refer to the black nobility, right? So they're still behind the scenes, and that was another feature of the Middle Ages. A feature of the Middle Ages, a common one, persistent theme, was you would have these aristocrats, and they would fight the king. And so, like for instance, in England, you had King John, who was taken out, and he was forced. They took him to a clearing, they put a sword up to his throat, and they said, "You're going to sign Magna Carta," thereby shifting power away from the monarchy to the aristocrats, and we're going to call this Parliament. And the House of Lords are now going to be doing the laws, not the king. And so whenever they say, "Oh, this is a country of a rule of law," as opposed to rule of a monarch, it sounds really good. Oh, rule of law, but then it's really rule of the lawmakers. So originally the lawmaker was the king, just like Hammurabi was the lawmaker, or Solon of Athens, Moses. It was usually the king was the lawmaker. And so all of a sudden, these oligarchs essentially take that power away, and they're going to say, okay, well, we're going to be running this according to an oligarchical model where the aristocrats are there. And a lot of kings would fight back by essentially going to the people. The Greeks called this a tyrant. Like a tyrant was somebody, like we think tyrant, dictator, despot, we use those as synonyms, but a tyrant was somebody from the ruling class who appealed to the people for help, right? And in that sense, like Trump would be an example of a modern, like a billionaire who appeals to populism to try to help him pivot around this other group of billionaires. And so that happened in Europe, all over the place, in England and Germany, where the king realized, hey, okay, I'm very powerful, but I'm not as powerful as all the aristocrats combined. They have a bigger army than me. They have a bigger tax base if they coordinate. Like Adam Smith said in The Wealth of Nations, he said that it's naive to believe that the masters do not combine. If you don't think that the masters don't combine, then you are as ignorant of history as you are of the subject. So he believed in conspiracies that the rich do coordinate. And so the king found this out and was basically, how do I drain some of their soldiers? How do I drain some of their tax base? So the king started creating these things called free cities. And they said, okay, so we're going to get some of the peasants off of the aristocrats' land. And by doing this, we will be depriving them of soldiers, and we will be depriving them of a tax base. So all of a sudden, these first free cities start showing up in Europe. And it was really the king trying to get more people on his side. And he made this deal with them. He said, well, I'll give you more political rights. You'll get to vote and stuff if you come into these free cities. And ironically, one of the groups that went and took him up on that were the merchants, that would evolve into the mercantile groups. But yeah, I mean, the Middle Ages was fraught with these power dynamics that are still in play. We still watch these all over the world, where you have these oligarchical groups fighting the nominal president or whatever leader that is. But I was interested, like where this rabbit hole goes down even deeper was, okay, so the Protestant Reformation happens in the 1550s. The Catholic Church loses all this power, all this territory, all these tithes, right? And you get something called the First Dutch Republic of 1588, right? And so this, in the Dutch Republic, is where they invent the joint stock company, the very first joint stock company. They invent the stock exchange. Like all these things that we take for granted today as staples of the modern world happened in the Netherlands as a result of these tithes going from the church now to these mercantile groups. And they created the Dutch East India Company. And, and it's funny too, because on your Telegram channel, you had an image of State Street and Vanguard and, BlackRock and stuff, and showing how they have these mercantile, these Dutch East India Company ships on this logo, So to this day, they're making references to that. But one of the things I always wondered about, just getting back to the flag of the United States, I always noticed that it doesn't have a cross on it. And I was like, that's odd. Why is there no cross? Every other flag prior to this had crosses on it. And it doesn't have a cross. Well, there's an answer to that. These people, the mercantile guilds, wanted to their stated goal was to get rid of all thrones and altars, right? Get rid of the power of the church, get rid of the power of the monarchs. And then you have this third group, the mercantile guilds will rule. And so the first template of that was the Dutch Republic of 1588, where all of a sudden you have this republic where there's no kings ruling, there's no church ruling. So then who's ruling? And of course, the answer to that is the Dutch East India Company, the first kind of joint stock company. And this shifts over to England, but I'll shut up. Jump in, interrupt me, because I have a habit to have these outpourings.
Something that comes to mind there is, again, when you look at the Illuminati, and I'm talking about documented stuff. You can't see in the frame here. I got a book. I forget who published it, but it's like primary source text from the 1800s of the Illuminati, and then it's the French Revolution, the whole Voltaire-like ideas, and Marxism, and this Gnostic Marxism. Let's say, James Lindsay, who's an atheist, right, refers to all of this as this Gnostic cult. And in the Illuminati's writings, in the French revolutionaries, in the Marxists and Gnostics, they all want to do away with religion. I subscribe to Lucis Trust's newsletter. They're also in that same vein. These Luciferians have the same philosophy as these Marxists and Gnostics and Illuminists, to do away with Christianity, religion entirely. Do you see any connection there?
Well, yeah, definitely. Okay, so whatever, and we go back to mercantilism, right? Whatever country was the mercantile head, basically, their elites would despise everything that was domestic, everything that was, from their own country. And they would always kind of celebrate and lionize anything that was foreign, because it showed, oh, I'm sophisticated. Look, I'm traveling to all these countries, much like yourself, Troy. Mongolia and Croatia and the United States.
I'm secretly a mercantilist.
A globalist. Yeah, but that's very, like, Cicero talks about that in De Republica. Cicero talks about the mercantile cultures, like he mentions like a Phoenician city-state, Sidon, I think it was. He mentions a couple Greek city-states, and he says that one of the downsides of this mercantilist culture is it erodes the domestic institutions as they start bringing foreign ideas in from all these places. And so you see that in the Republic of Venice. When the Republic of Venice was the mercantile capital of Europe, you saw the first outburst of alchemy as they were getting these ideas from the East. And then that center of power basically shifts to England. And when it shifts to England, now those same esoteric kind of, internationalist ideas from the East start popping up with theosophy. And you see people with fezzes, imitating Egypt. You see them with the Freemasonic, Egypt. And this was part and parcel of mercantilism, of them showing how sophisticated I am. Look, I'm getting these ideas from the East. What is sophisticate? And this gets us back to that flag. The flag that they used, the British East India Company, that looks much like the American flag, had 13 red and white stripes. Now, we're told as kids, oh, those are 13 stripes for 13 colonies. But here's the problem. Those 13 stripes were there before. The British East India Company was founded in 1600. There weren't 13 colonies in 1600. And so interestingly, the guy who founded the British East India Company, he was an Englishman named Thomas Smythe. He was also the treasurer of the Virginia Corporation. So you see these connections between the British East India Company and the founding of the United States. Several of the founding fathers in the United States were Masons. And this is where it gets back to the Mason thing. So I looked up a French intellectual. Well, if you look up the flag, by the way, it says, why were there 13 stripes on that 1600 flag? And it said, because in Freemasonry, 13 was a lucky number. So then I was like, oh, that's interesting. So I put in a search engine, British East India Company, Masonry, just because of that. And it said that the Freemasonic lodges started as an adjunct of the British East India Company. Everywhere they would go, they would put down an embassy. And this embassy was just a place where Englishmen could get together and they would get newspapers from home. They could network, they could advance in their career. And it was like a little enclave of the West if they were in India or elsewhere. And by the way, the first Freemasonic lodge that they had planted in India had the same flag with the 13 red and white stripes in the blue field in the center, or in the corner. And so these Freemasonic lodges, there was a French scholar, as I said, talking about that, how this is, Freemasonry and the British East India Company were like this, right? Because one was an adjunct to the other. And most conspiracy theorists, they put the Freemasonic lodges as if they're the actuating principle. but actually they're a symptom of the British East India. They are just there where the British East India Company went. And so, yeah, I mean, the Mayflower, as an example, was a British East India Company ship. There's an audiobook. I sent you a file, too, of William Dalrymple, who was a historian, a Scottish historian, and he does a history of the British East India Company in his book called The Anarchy. And he talks about how the Mayflower in the United States was a British East India Company ship. So I don't know if you want to add that little sample there, you can. You don't have to, but yeah. So I was just interested. I was like, the British East India Company keeps coming up over and over in the founding of the United States, and for instance, the God, what was his name? Robert something or other. It's going to come to me. But the main financier of the American Revolution, all of his holdings were with the British East India Company. All the founding fathers were Masons, with the British, Freemasonic people. That the outlay of the United States, the grid of Washington D.C. is on these Masonic symbols. The little obelisk for the Washington Monument is a Freemasonic symbol that you'll see in all these all these British East India Company enclaves will have these Egyptian symbols because they thought that was, hey, look, we're sophisticate, mercantilists, we're men of the world, But I'll shut up. Go jump in.
I mean, again, for me, this all makes perfect sense. To ask you a couple questions there. So it just seems like what we have today is a continuation of all of that: the BlackRock, the Vanguard, the World Economic Forum. Because basically, our nation, it's a corporation. We're run. America's United Incorporated States of America. We're run by these transnational financial class. I think they do this to most countries, are run by this transnational corporate class. And so on that, and then also I think I've seen many documentaries where, Manly P. Hall, famous Freemason, and others, they've talked about the creation of the United States as some occult Freemasonic, as you say, maybe British imperial project. They refer to it as an Atlantis. And something interesting for me here, someone who's born in the U.S., a proud, patriotic sort of Americana philosophy that I have, but I think I don't mind swallowing bitter pills, and I kind of view one possibility, because I always focus on world government because I think that's kind of where we're going or destined to go, and I see the model of the United States, the United States of America, the 50 states in the Union. Now we're seeing this being replicated in Europe. They're calling for United States of Europe. There's a quote from George Washington 200 years ago where he said, in the future, we want to have a United States of Europe. And I kind of see this as the template for world government. So this United States of America, United States of Europe model, they want to create a United States of the world. And so I could kind of see a link between what you're talking about in the initial stages and then them trying to create this Atlantis in the West, and then that being their way of then what would you call it, stepping stone towards like a world system. So your thoughts on some of these things?
Well, no, I mean, look at the United States. As I said, Thomas Smythe, the guy who founded the British East India Company, was also, as I said, the treasurer of the Virginia Corporation, which creates the Virginia colony. These were places you could buy stock in. So when you say, oh, the United States is a corporation, yeah, it started that way, as a joint stock company. This was a money-making operation, as opposed, I have a friend who is at the Bank of Canada. He's a Mexican national, and he moved from Mexico to Canada. And he's doing a study right now on the difference of the colonization of Mexico versus the corporation that we know as the United States. And one was done by the Catholic Church, and one was done by this new mercantile guild. And you look at the differences. So whenever the Catholic Church would found something, they would usually be a saint name, Saint Maria, Saint San Diego, they would have these saint names. Oftentimes when the corporation would come in, because large swaths of what we now know as the United States, not even on the West Coast, but even on the East Coast, the Spanish Empire went as far north as South Carolina. And like St. Augustine in Florida would be an example of the older Spanish kind of colonies on the East Coast. And the corporation would come and remove the saint name because they wanted to get rid of thrones and altars. And they would put like an Indian name, from the local place, or they would put some, kind of corporate name, McDonald's or something, as the new city. But my friend from the Central Bank of Canada, he talks about how Mexico, the way that they created the society was much different. He talks about how they tithed the people, but those tithes actually went toward building aqueducts, building infrastructure, streets. They would give pensions to old people. And he shows, as an economist, he shows that when the church ran things, most of the money did end up going back to the people. However, when the corporation in north of the border, this Protestant kind of, thing happens, most of the money is siphoned away from the people to these corporate stockholders, these shareholders. And so it's a very different kind of governance model. And there's a writer named Penny Kelly, and she talks about that. She says for 1,500 years, the church ruled. And then after that, in 1688, you have 500 years of the nation state. And then after that, you have this third iteration of corporate rule. Right. And so Mexico was founded by stage one, by a society that was not primarily economic. It was soul based, spiritual based, the God and the church and stuff like that. Then you have this second iteration, right, of the nation state, and now you have this third of the corporate state. And we're in a transitional period from the nation state into this kind of corporatocracy. But yeah, you see the creation in that Dutch Republic of 1588. You saw the creation of a joint stock company. You saw all these colonies organized on a corporate model. Like I'll give you an example. I live in South Carolina. And in South Carolina, I was reading a guy named Walter Edgar, and he wrote a history of South Carolina. And he says that South Carolina was founded very differently from the northeastern states. He said a lot of the northeastern states had these utopian Christians and Quakers and Puritans. He said South Carolina, however, was built as a joint stock company, as a stock operation, as a corporation. And he said because of that, he said that South Carolina did not have any civic institutions. It was not meant to be a home. It was not meant to be a country. It was meant to make money. So they put slaves in. They, it's very brutal and dystopian, like the setup. And that was the 1600s. They had already had this model. It was based on the earlier Barbados model that England had running. And Barbados collapses. A lot of the population moves to South Carolina. They create this corporate structure. And a lot of the instability that would lead to the American Revolution and the Civil War was because South Carolina was very tumultuous because it was not designed as a home. It was designed as a corporation, very cynically. And because it didn't have civic structures, it very easily collapsed. And, and it led to a lot of chaos, which spread as a contagion through the rest of the colonies, leads to, all these things. And now they're basically, when you look at globalization now, it's really just mercantilism. They want to remake all the nations like South Carolina. It's a corporation, where a few stockholders get money off of it, but the rest of you have to live in a dystopia. With men with guns, maintaining law and order because there's, just savagery and people raping people and just crime everywhere, but it's okay as long as the bottom line is met. So, that's unfortunate.
That was my next question. As you mentioned, and what you just discussed, this new model that we're transitioning to, this mercantilist corporate model, there's many synonyms as what people are labeling it today, right? I think we can use the term Great Reset, right? And then things like 15-minute cities, smart cities, it could come into play. This whole, as I call it, the algorithm ghetto option, the cashless society, CBDCs. To get your thoughts on, to get your further thoughts, what is it they want? How do they want to rule the world now? Where are they taking us? And it seems like they want to do this in every single nation. There's not going to be a place any longer that will be exempt, because maybe to get your thoughts, this includes this idea of BRICS and multipolarity, because I see this same sort of system, which you just touched on, they're trying to implement it literally in every single nation on the planet. Your further thoughts?
Yeah, like Catherine Austin Fitch, she said that she was talking about the growing technocratic infrastructure apparatus that they're putting together. And she said, so people look at Putin and are like, oh, well, he's really a good guy because he's fighting these globalists, but really he's using the same architecture and implementing all the same policies. And she said, what's actually happening is a debate, not over getting rid of that kind of slave, kind of apparatus, but who's going to control it. And she said in the West, they've determined corporations are going to control it, whereas Russia and China want the state to control it. They want the nation state. So once again, you see this transitional period, 1,500 years of the church, 500 years of the nation state, now corporatocracy, 50 years. And, so they're kind of in the 20th century as this nation state model. And so that's what the battle is. The battle is not over freedom versus tyranny. It's going to be who's ruling the tyranny. But yeah, where this is going I was talking to a friend about this. Herbert Spencer. Herbert Spencer talks about in his study of sociology, you understand how a civilization works by understanding its institutions. And so when you put an institution in place, you're putting a system in place. And Donella Meadows in Thinking in Systems, she says, if it doesn't repeat, it's not a system. So all systems are just algorithms that repeat, right? Like I always use the example of our Constitution in the United States is an algorithm, right? So it says every 4 years you vote for a president, every 6 years you vote for a senator or whatever. And so it's just repetitions. And so it's not that history repeats itself, it's that institutions repeat themselves. So if you have very similar institutions, like a lot of the corruption we're seeing now, and people equate it either to the Roman Empire or, very interestingly, the Spanish Empire. There's a lot of parallels with the United States. Because we've imitated their institutions. So you're going to see a lot of the same perverse incentives, a lot of the same behavioral patterns, not because history repeats it, but because institutions. And likewise, just going back to the mercantile guilds, they ran the Middle Ages in a socialistic the feudal system, right? So when people talk about, oh, this neofeudalism they want to run it, of course it is, because it's a system and it will repeat. So what they're going to do is they want to take us back to how they ran Europe in the 1300s and the 1200s. And yeah, so that's what that's about. So people are always confused. They're always like, wait, but how could the capitalist corporations, they're capitalists, and this communist feudal thing you're talking about, that's totally, like contradictory. And it's not. When you look at the history of the mercantile guilds, that's exactly how they operated. And so since the 1500s, they have basically done this campaign of, we've got to get rid of kings, we've got to get rid of the church, because it leaves us in charge. And that's what this is really about. It's a turf war between these three groups that have been fighting since the Middle Ages. And so they're remaking this. Robert Kennedy, by the way, I wanted to make this point. He actually, in a speech, he talks about the British East India Company and its role in 1772 in the American Revolution. And we're not taught this in history, But he says, yeah, because of the basically, William Dalrymple covers this as well in his book. He said that, and this is where this gets interesting. Not only is the modern nation state what we think of as the republics that sprang up all over the place with no crosses on their flags, right? All of a sudden you get Italy, you get France, all these revolutions where corporate states take over. They push the church out, they push the state, the monarch out, and But they, in addition to that, they essentially, take over, like the economic strains of the country, the cultural strains of the country. And so Robert Kennedy talks about how, essentially the British East India Company goes into debt. There's this guy named Fortis, I think his name was Andrew Fortis, and he tries to short British East India Company stock. And he loses like $300,000, which is like billions of dollars in today's money. And he runs to France. He doesn't want to pay his creditors off. He flees. It causes like a banking crash. All these banks that are heavily invested in British East India Company, 61% of Parliament, all of them had British East India Company stock. George III had British East India Company stock. And for the first time in history, you have a too big to bail corporate bailout, where England, for the first time, says, okay, this is too big. The British East India Company had an army twice the size of the British Army. They were all over the world, running as a de facto nation state, an empire. And so they said, if this goes down, it's going to take all of us down. So we're going to basically bail them out, and we're going to tax the American colonies and all of our other colonies to bail out the British East India Company. We're never told that. We're always told, oh, maybe something to do with the French and Indian War or war debt. No, it was the British East India Company in 1772. And now here's the second aspect that stays with us in the modern world. There was no lender of last resort. For any stocks or bonds, anything that went bad, any security that went bad, there was no lender of last resort. So then they create these things called central banks that become lenders. So these things, these institutions that we still have to this day, were as a result of the British East India Company essentially using the nation state, or this ostensible shell company of a nation state, to basically take money from the productive workers and then transfer it to themselves. And we're still seeing the same behavior. Why? Because institutions repeat. When you have the same institutions, so very, very interesting that Robert Kennedy mentioned that, but we're never told, this history of, these corporations and why our revolution happened. Yeah.
The revolution has started 2 years before. And it started when the British had passed an oppressive law raising the taxes on tea in New England. And this was a law that the British Crown made in collusion with the British East India Company, which the king owned shares in, his ministers owned shares in, and most of the aristocracy owned shares in. And it was their plan to impose the tax on New England merchants, but exempt the British East India Company from the tax so that they could undersell everybody and that they would make a profit for their shareholders. So the revolution, and of course, the Americans responded by dressing as Wampanoag Indians and boarding the British East India Company's ships and dumping the tea into the harbor. And that's when the British sent that troop over here to quell the rebellion. So that rebellion was in part against empire, but the spear tip of that rebellion was a fury that the colonists against the merger, the corrupt merger of state and corporate power.
He really nailed that, Rick.
He did. And Doc, did he deliberately choose to announce his candidacy on the anniversary of the
Ride of Paul Revere and,
yes,
and facing of British troops?
We need
a new revolution, that's for sure. But for him to, and I'd never really thought about it before. I know revolutionary history and everything, but never really made the connection between the collusion between government and corporations. You think about it in today's world, but you don't think about it in the 1770s. But that's exactly what happened. The British government was deep in bed with the British East India Company, exempted that company from having to pay taxes on tea. That made it an unequal competition for the colonists. The colonists responded, in like manner. It is interesting that he makes that connection.
There was corporate welfare.
Yes.
In the 1700s.
A number of guests that I've had on, like Alex Craner, Matt Ehret, and they're a little bit LaRouche. I don't see anything bad with that. I think LaRouche had a lot of good analysis, but these folks tend to point their finger often at the British Empire. And if we talk about today, where the power is centered at, is that sort of a moot point? Or is the power sort of like, how might I describe it, centered, ethereal? It's kind of like, it's this global, like it's kind of like in space, symbolically speaking. There's no real geographical center that we have this transnational now class where they're not centered anywhere particularly, or do you still feel like King Charles III and the city of London is a keynote of everything going on, or
you just. Mm-hmm. You described God, right? Giordano Bruno, Jorge Luis Borges had like 6 different people, Pascal, Giordano Bruno. They all had the same concept of God is a sphere whose circumference is everywhere and whose center is nowhere or whatever. So it was interesting that you're describing this power elite, this amorphous, diffuse, nebulous power elite, almost like an invisible God. I was just talking, and this might interest you because it interested me. I was talking to Vicki Davis, and Vicki just interviewed her the other day. And she had a really interesting insight. And we talked about how the British, essentially, the creation of the UN, like how did that come about? And so essentially the origins, as everybody knows, goes back to the League of Nations in World War I. Subsequent to World War I, Britain had bankrupted itself. And we were talking about, I never thought of it in these terms, that when you go bankrupt, like Argentina or like Mexico, in the 90s, you default on bonds or whatever. People will stop loaning to you. It's a very terrible thing. Nobody wants to default. And so, what does England do? England says, hey, let's create this shell company. We're going to call it the League of Nations and eventually the United Nations. We're going to create the shell company. And I was talking to her, I was watching this guy's video, and he was saying how the rich do not pay taxes. And he says, okay, so create a trust at the top, and then you have a holding company. And the holding company is owned 100% by that trust. It gets all the assets. But if you get sued, it's the holding company that is responsible for the liabilities, right? And then underneath that holding company, you might have LLCs. You'll have LLC 1, LLC 2, LLC 3. So if you look at this, what they created was this shell company, right? Where there's a blind trust at the top, and then there's a holding company called the United Nations. And then underneath this holding company are nation states, right? So what they did was essentially say, hey, we don't want to go bankrupt. We don't want to, how do I keep from going bankrupt, but I still want to control things. So I'm going to outsource my liabilities to the shell company, right? And then I'll still be able to run the world. I'll still be able to have my colonies, except now my colonies will be done through the shell company that now is, so I get all the benefits with none of the liabilities. And for a military, which was a huge expense, we'll get the United States, but later it'll become NATO. Right. So now we're not going to have to pay for our own military. We're not going to have to pay any of these liabilities. We will outsource it. And so now what you see is the nation state turning into a corporation. Right. Operating very much like a corporation. And that's what we're watching. We're watching this new organizing principle that is not the organizing principle of the church, a society based around spirituality, is not the organizing principle of the nation state, which is organized around patriotism. You have this third iteration of the corporate state. And this, I always wondered why me and Vicky were talking about this, why racism is the new kind of taboo. You're a witch, right? Racism, all this kind of stuff. And I realized because in the organizing principle of the church, if you would ask Queen Isabella what she was in 1492, what are you? Her go-to would have been Christian, right? The world saw itself in terms of religion because that's how it was organized. Islam, it still does. But then the nation state comes up, and Albert Camus pointed out, he said that Bismarck had an awful time unifying the German nation state because they were so disparate until he came up with the myth of race, a common race, right? So whenever you go to a nation state, the building of a nation state, its organizing principle is not your religious affiliation, but your race. And so political Zionism, which kind of grew up in the same time period of the Germans and Anschluss and stuff, it has a lot of that going. And because they're at the opening stages of the creation of a nation, they're very they care about their citizens. They're very ethnic, cohesive, and all this kind of stuff. And so people are now yelling at them. The left is yelling at them. Oh, you're racist and you're this and you're that. Well, all nation states are at their founding. Only when they start to decay into this corporate structure does racism basically become the new, you're a pagan. We've got to remove the old culture and we've got to bring in this new culture. So what they're doing with the anti-racism is it dissolves the nation state. Right. So that's actually why they're going after it, because they want the dissolution of nation states so that the corporate structure, the new ideology, like I talked to J.R. Nyquist and he talked about that Christianity, the way Christianity spread was very similar, that it displaced the earlier religions. It happened in the cities. Christianity spread in the cities. The pagans were the people in the rural areas, right? The farmers and stuff. And that's what the word in Latin pagan means. It means like hillbilly, hick, because Christianity was from the cities. And so now you're seeing in the cities this new ideology emanating, this, and to dissolve the old ideology, just like the Christians did. Oh, you're a witch. If you worship Zeus or you worship Hera or something, you're a witch, and your gods are demons. And so that's why racism is the new kind of bugaboo, because they need to dissolve it to dissolve the nation state so that you get this new corporate structure. So.
Hey, I wasn't kidding when I said top tier analyst. I've had these ideas in my head, but you're just much better at more eloquently putting it out there. And just to step back, you mentioned UN and NATO, and I've always believed, again, the purpose of the UN, just as you outlined, this corporate structure, but to be the world government. In their own writings, they've called it world corporation. World government. My point is they want a structure for total global political and economic control. And that I've always believed that NATO, it was planned to become the one world army as an adjunct to the UN. And we're seeing that now. They're calling for NATO to become the one world army. Literally, they're saying this. There was an article a month ago saying, let's rename it to new, instead of North Atlantic Terrorist Organization. I mean, that's how I call it. They want to rename it to New Alliance Treaty Organization because this mission is now global. They're trying to use, one of their tactics is like in Latin America, Colombia, they've called it a global NATO partner or something. That's their way of, it's a global NATO partner. And then a few years later, it becomes a member of NATO in Latin America, right? That's how I see it. And so your further thoughts on, as we now transition to this corporate structure, and I think regional unions are next. I mean, what do you think? Because I'm hearing the EU is that blueprint now. Because I've been repeating this because for me it's important. My Mexican president, López Obrador, AMLO, he specifically said this year that we should integrate Canada, USA, and Mexico based on the EU model. Bukele in El Salvador says we should integrate Central America based on the EU model. The South Americans are saying we should integrate South America based on the EU model. So that kind of, I think, is exactly what you're talking about. So your thoughts on NATO becoming the world army, and then how they're from here on out, what will this corporate structure look like?
Well, like I said, the British East India Company at their height, their army, the army of a corporation, was twice the size of the English army, right? So you have a corporation with a military branch, and so that they're just replicating that, right? And so, like Aristotle in Politics, he says, what are the basic components of any government? And he said one is infrastructure, two is a judiciary, and he said three is a military. Right. So if you have any of these three elements, you have a government. And so for decades, they were like, oh, this is a conspiracy theory, the UN and world government. Oh, it's just a conspiracy theory. But then they quietly created the components of a government. They created, for infrastructure, they created the World Bank and the IMF. They created an international court system in The Hague. Right. And now with NATO, they're creating a global military. You take those Lego pieces, you click them together, voila. World government, it does all the functions of government. And this is interesting. Aristotle actually adds a fourth component that we don't use. The fourth component was the temple, religion. He said that the fourth, and they're even going to do that. Like you mentioned, the Lucius Trust, right? Like all this kind of Luciferian stuff that they're doing, that's based on these, the kind of mercantilist, fake, pseudo, quasi esotericism of the East, that they're trying to cobble together through syncretism, this kind of secular, religion. I mean, look at, like, for instance, the Catholic Church, right? Catholic means universal, the universal church, or the global church. So globalism is basically Catholicism without God, right? You maintain all the structures of a religion, but without, a nominal, like Hitler said that. Hitler said he was a great fan of the Catholic Church, not in the sense of any religious thing, but how good it was as an organizing principle, how you administer a society. And he used a lot of those same structures. Intelligence agencies, by the way, explicitly were based on the Jesuits from the Catholic Church. So in iteration one of a ruling system where the church ruled things, you had the Jesuits going around and they would infiltrate countries. Oh, by the way, this gets back to the British East India Company, by the way, as well. All roads lead there, apparently. So the reason why the flag, by the way, doesn't have a cross on it, right, was because the British East India Company hoisted up their 13 red and white stripes with the Union Jack, which is two crosses, the cross of St. George and St. Andrew combined, right, the British flag. And so they went into the Japanese harbor to trade, do their mercantile activities. And the Japanese said, hey, we just kicked these Jesuits out. They were spying. They really weren't trying to start churches. They were just trying to subvert our government. And we kicked them out. We don't trust Christians anymore. If you have a cross on your flag, we will not allow you into our harbor. So they removed the cross, which is why the United States flag does not have a cross. By the way, if you look at the original flag George Washington fought under, he fought under something, and people can look this up right now. It's called the Continental Colors, and it is identical with the British East India Company flag, 13 red and white stripes with the Union Jack originally. But then the British East India Company has to have that removed, and we have at the same time and replace it with stars. But so we're watching a lot of these same structures. I wanted to hit this point as well. The emergence of republics as opposed to monarchies. We were always taught, oh, that's a great thing. Look, no kings, and we're getting, these republics. It starts with the Dutch Republic in 1588, where a corporation is ruling. Get rid of the crosses on the flags. Corporations run things. Central banks run things. And so basically, England, basically the power shifts from the Netherlands to England when King Charles I basically makes a mistake and he seizes the gold from a Dutch bank in England. And he's like, I'm the king. I can do whatever I want. I'm going to seize your gold. The Dutch bankers were very angry at that. And they basically train and provide arms and logistics to a guy named Oliver Cromwell. And they send Cromwell into England. He beheads Charles I and he found something called, the Commonwealth of England, or the First Republic of England. So just like the Netherlands, the Dutch Republic of 1588, they outsourced this new republic model to England, right? And then from England, the United States becomes a republic. It's a corporate state, with no crosses, no kings, no church. Corporation is going to be ruling you, and that's the new model. And so we were always sold this idea that, oh, isn't a republic an advance, and isn't it this greater thing? But really, it's a mask for this corporate structure. For like in my country or yours, well, Mexico is better, and I'm going to consider that your country.
But yeah.
But you grew up in the United States, just like I did, and we were always told. I mean, you can attest to that, right? How superior the republics were, and getting away from those bad, icky kings. But the kings had a adversarial relationship with the guilds, and now we don't. Now we have politicians who are very, kind of in the pockets of these corporations, and it was thus from the beginning, like the central bank model that the British East India Company starts, and Alexander Hamilton, no sooner than the United States is founded than they put a central bank in. And it was called the First Bank of the United States. Alexander Hamilton does it, I think, in 1791. The ink is not even dry on the Constitution. He does this unconstitutional thing. He had no authority to bring a central bank over. They do, and 80% of its stock is owned by the Bank of England. So you do this economic takeover of the United States through these central banks. I mean, stuff that was happening back then is still happening. I mean, it's funny. I mean, history has not changed because the institutions have not changed, and we've done a very bad job of tracing back the origins of these institutions. And when you do, you keep hitting the British East India Company over and over and over.
Well, one thing that I've had on my mind, before you coming on, but as well, you mentioning this stuff now. And I fully agree with you. We're taught that the republic is the best system, and I've come to believe that living under a good king could be good as well. And more my Christian worldview is I take the line that Jesus did. My kingdom is not of this world, so it doesn't really matter what political system I live under. I was talking with some Croatians, and as a Croatian, we're now living under the European Empire again, the European Union, Yugoslavia, as we call it. We were, before 2013, for 20 years, Croatian Republic. Before that was communist Yugoslavia. Then for 3 years, a Nazi Croatian regime. Then, the kingdom of the Slovenes and Serbs and Croats. And, then under the Roman Empire. So it's like, it really doesn't matter because it doesn't matter what political system you live under, because you throughout history, you're living all throughout these different political systems. And then for me as a Christian, it's just like that's not the point of life. For me, just the spiritual is different from the political. But your thoughts on that, but also given that we live under these corporate Dutch republics, we have experienced in the last couple hundred years relative prosperity. The fact that you and I can live in this middle class, relatively prosperous lifestyle, it hasn't been all that bad, has it?
Well, it depends. Like in The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith, and this is all from the same time period, right? 1772, British East India Company writes The Wealth of Nations in 1776. Very landmark year, 1776, founding of the Illuminati, 1776. But anyway, Adam Weishaupt. But it's funny because that's stigmatized. I'm not allowed to mention that. But so Adam Smith talks about what is wealth, and he says money is not wealth, right? He says money is just a unit of exchange to acquire wealth. He says wealth is land, wealth is potable water, wealth is wheat, right? That's actual wealth. He also says, interestingly, you can judge the wealth of a society by how many children you can afford, right? So if you could afford 10 children, that's a wealthy society. If you can afford no children and you're living in a cardboard box with a cat, but you've got lots of fiat currency, are you really wealthy? Did it lift all ships? Our grandparents owned land. Our great grandparents owned land. Do you own any? What is the land ownership? So has it really created all this wealth, or is that a talking point? As they give you these Chuck E. Cheese tokens, and you're living poor, and they intend you to get even more poor. As we own nothing and we'll be happy. So yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, and this mercantilist structure, by the way, that they want to kind of enforce. There was two things that were against it. One was capitalism. When capitalism rises up, it is a direct threat to mercantilism, because now you can make your own stuff. So that was one of the problems in the American colonies. The Americans were like, hey, I want to make my own shirt for $1. But the British are like, no, you don't get to manufacture anything. William Pitt, even in 1770, he said, the Americans should not be able to even manufacture a horseshoe nail. They're just going to stay a plantation colony. We will do all the manufacturing, and we'll sell you back that shirt for $20, and we'll make $19. And the Americans were like, but I can make this for $1. using capitalism. And so they were like, nope, you're going to do this global supply chain so that we make money. If you made your own stuff through this capitalism thing, where's that going to leave us? So they were very anti-capitalist. They were mercantilist. They were globalist. And so that's why they attacked Germany in World War I. H.G. Wells in 1899, he wrote a book called Anticipations, 1899. And he said Germany is, through capitalism, through factory production, they're basically displacing the old slave model of the mercantilist model of having colonies in like Indonesia. Like if you wanted rubber, the British East India Company would sail, get rubber from rubber tree plants, bring it back. It was very costly, use slaves and models and infrastructure, all this, had to build bridges and ports, very expensive. The Germans innovated and said, hey, let's create synthetic rubber for pennies on the dollar. It will be cheaper. It's of higher quality. People started buying the German product, and the English said, we have to take them down. In 1899, they were already thinking of pretexts to take capitalism down because they wanted their mercantilist global supply chain. And so what they want to do now is erase all of our nation states because they're saying, hey, if we have separate nations, this hurts our global supply chain because for accounting purposes, if you have different tariff rates, different tax rates, different judicial structures, this will be a pain to us. What if we harmonize the laws around the world? Let's erase all the lines. It'll be easier for the global supply chain. Now, you had a guest on, and I'm going to be talking to him soon, Jack Buffington, and he was talking about the collapse of supply chain number one. If that goes down, right, you're going to have a challenge to the global, the mercantilists, the British East India Company of today, the World Economic Forum. They're the direct descendant, where they want to erase nation states. So if we can, he talks about supply chain 2.0, where we make our own things, where we have 3D printing, where it's kind of like in the American colonies in the 1700s. Hey, why do I need this global supply? I could get things cheaper and without the fuel costs and all these things. He mentioned jeans. If you send jeans from, Indonesia, it used to be 15 cents. Now it's $1. Everything's getting more costly. So supply chain 2.0, this is capitalism 2.0. This, just as capitalism was a threat to their mercantilist model, supply chain 2.0 is going to be, they're going to go crazy trying to stop it, because if we get that, we're going to get nation states again. We're going to be able to maintain our own civilizations, and that's the good news. So I don't know, that's emerging right now, so we'll see where that goes.
There's some hope there. So we are in this struggle. Nothing is set in stone, and that was sort of my next question on how do you see them succeeding? What do we do? Do we, my view is always we need to resist, and we also have to prepare, let's resist, but I need to have like a farm ready to fall back to, like a prepper type thing. And so you see them being able to, put the cherry on top of their world government, or, before it happens, there's still, a lot of things will go wrong for them. Your thoughts? Yeah.
I mean, every system goes through entropy. It falls apart. No system lasts forever. You thought that the Catholic Church was insurmountable, as a secular organization. It ran all the schools, it paved all the roads, it did everything, all the pensions, charity, everything the Catholic Church did. How could they ever fall? And of course they do. And then the nation state rises up and you get the kings and stuff. And by the way, you mentioned that you don't have a problem with monarchy. Neither did Thomas Hobbes or Aristotle or Cicero. They said, if you could have a pure form of government, what would be the best pure form of government? And they said monarchy. They said republics. They said if you could have a mixed form of government. And so Cicero basically describes having the three classical forms as a mixed form. And he said, so the classical forms are monarchy, aristocracy, and republic, right? And so they had basically like a king type figure that called the consul. Then they had the Roman Senate, which was the aristocracy. And then they had the plebeians, like the House of Plebeians, And so England had the same thing. They had a king, they had a House of Lords and a House of Commons. The United States did it with a president, with the Senate, and with the House of Representatives. That was so it was a mixed form of government. It wasn't a pure republic. The Articles of Confederation, we were a pure republic under that, but they got rid of that, got the mixed form of government. And he said, if you couldn't have the mixed form of government, which would offset the liabilities and the bad aspects and kind of keep some of the good aspects, he said, even that will decay. He said, but if you had to have a pure form, I would rather have monarchy, because who's in charge. And in Leviathan, Hobbes makes that point. He says, in a monarchy, everybody knows who's in charge. He said, in a republic, where anybody can be the leader, you get all this internecine fighting and everybody attacks each other. And he said the only time that a republic is at peace is when it has an external enemy. He said, if you do not have an external enemy, it'll immediately fall into this fractious kind of infighting. And we've seen the United States as a republic where they've only had peace for, I think, 3 years of their entire history. There's always some global conflict. And the biggest existential threat to the United States happened with the nominal collapse of the Soviet Union, because we had this external enemy. And then no sooner does the Soviet Union go down than all of a sudden the United States starts attacking itself, that all the different demographics, all the different groups. And so Hobbes warned about that this happened. I mean, the Greeks knew about this, so there are inherent, kind of liabilities to the republic that we were never told as kids. We were never told, hey, you're going to be given to war, because war is the only thing that will hold you, keep everybody from each other's throats. So you're going to be at war all the time with this. We're told, these myths that, oh, no democracy has ever gone to war against another. It's Francis Fukuyama kind of stuff, but none of that is true. Without war, we will attack ourselves so that people could vie for power. We saw this in the Roman Empire, where they would actually, in Empires of Trust by Thomas Madden, he talks about Scipio Africanus defeating Hannibal. He defeated one of the greatest generals, bar only Alexander the Great, defeats him. Everybody loves him. The people love him. And the Senate's first instinct is, how do we take him down? The people love him. They might make him into a king. If they make him into a king, we lose power. So to thank him for saving Rome, let's stab him in the back. We saw the same thing with Majorianus at the end of the Roman Empire in the 5th century. The barbarians had taken over. They'd taken over the Italian peninsula, they'd taken over Spain. He goes, gets Spain back, starts getting all these. He's this man of ethics and morals, and they said he was second only probably to Marcus Aurelius as an ethical leader. He goes back. The barbarians come in, they retake Spain. He goes back to Italy, and no sooner does he go back to Italy than the Senate stabs him in the back. They murder him in an assassination, and then the barbarians come in, take over. Roman Empire gone forever. So you have this structure that abets treason, where you have this Mitt Romney class of senators, and we see the same behavior because we have the same institutions. So we're watching, repetitions, and it's unfortunate, but it does give us, if you know the algorithm, you know where this is likely to go. So I do think that eventually, just like the church went down, just like the nation state went down, that corporatocracy will go down and probably be replaced by more of a church-like structure. We're going to be just like how monarchies degrade into republics degrade into dictatorships, which leads back to monarchy. So we're going to see a collapse, but on the other side of that collapse, I think that we're probably going to go back to a more God-centered society rather than, it's the economy, stupid. That's the thinking of the British East India Company. We're running this place like a Walmart, not your home. It's a Walmart. It's an economic zone. That's going to be gone, and it's going to be, but it's going to be hell getting through to that other side. But I think that's eventually what's going to happen. So
I hope you're right. And one thing you mentioned about war being necessary makes me think of 1967 report from Iron Mountain, which I don't think was a hoax, which I think was commissioned. And then they discuss how do they get to their world government, but being able to replace the militarist option. So they were brainstorming how to sort of like keep doing what they're doing, but without the war aspect. And they came up with the green ideology, and even and they discussed creating fake external enemies like international terrorism, like Bin Laden and
UFOs,
right? Yeah. And then they using UFO phenomenon and quote aliens, because I don't believe in them, as a way to continue doing what they're doing. So we've covered a lot. I hope people enjoyed this chat, and then of course they can continue to follow your channel. The link is in the description. But is there any final thought then for us as we head into World War III? And
well, one of the things final thought, just really quickly, there was a book called Scale by Geoffrey West. He's a physicist, and he was talking about the guy who invented fractals was a guy named Richardson in England, and he invented fractals, noting that every war seemed to increase exponentially. So you would have 2,500 people dying this century, then it would be 25,000, then 250,000. If you extrapolate up to that fractal, 250,000 people died, 250 million people died in the 20th century. So if you extrapolate up, that would be 2.5 billion in the 21st century. which is interesting. Charles Nenner, he's Dutch, by the way, Dutch Republic. He was talking about that he's seeing in the next global conflict a possible 2 billion. So when he said that, I was like, oh, that's interesting, because that accords with the fractal number of Richardson. Yeah. So who knows? I mean, so whether things get crazy like that, I don't know if it'll be conventional war, because they seem to be, that damages property and they don't want that. So it might be war by other means, so it might be bioweapons. We won't go there. It's going to be polycrisis. It's going to be a number of different things that they're going to use, to enslave the world. But as I said, the good news is the silo effect happens. Any large system will eventually break down. And I think that in the end they lose. But for right now, do what you said. Try to get some real wealth, get some farm, get a garden going, get some chickens and goats and apple trees, and buckle up.
Buckle up. That's it. I was listening to Charles Nenner's recent interview with Greg. Listen to him all the time. Greg Hunter. So yeah, he's that's good stuff. And hey, you're gonna irritate the no virus people when you mention biological weapons. Bioweapons don't exist. Gain of function that doesn't exist. So I'm being silly.
You said it. I didn't.
For those of us that believe whatever it is that we believe, we have to be able to laugh at ourselves. People mock me for being Christian and whatever. I laugh about it. Just as people listening who are into the no virus thing, who might get offended by what I just said, laugh at yourself. You have to be deprecating, but
facing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So great stuff, Daniel. I know you think you're restarting your YouTube channel. You'll be interviewing folks like Jack Buffington, and where do people best go to follow you?
Yeah, just go to my YouTube channel, The Daniel Natal Show, and I will see you there.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast. The website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and I encourage you to sign up for the free email list that goes out with each podcast and every weekend with a collection of news headlines. The newsletter and website are our last lines of defense. We're being censored and deplatformed. It's nearly impossible to find Geopolitics and Empire on the Google search engine. We've been blacklisted. YouTube frequently takes down our videos with strikes. Facebook restricts our page. Reddit and Twitter take down posts. And after the Associated Press mentioned Geopolitics and Empire in a 2021 article co-written with NATO, our Patreon account was terminated. Vimeo also terminated our Pro account. The best free way to help Geopolitics and Empire is to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or elsewhere and subscribe to all of our media channels. You can find the video broadcast now on 5 platforms: Odyssey, Rockfin, Rumble, BitChute, and Brighteon. You can find the audio broadcast on the podcast ecosystem: SoundCloud, Apple, Spotify, and so on. My current favorite social media channels are Twitter and Telegram, but you can also find us on Gab, MeWe, Minds, Float, VK, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Finally, Geopolitics and Empire is in dire need of funding to continue. You can leave a donation, purchase a consultation with the host, or become a member to receive additional benefits. We also produce a weekly broadcast called Dissident Thinker for members and Rockfin subscribers only. We will continue to fight the good fight come hell or high water. Thank you for listening.